We now will move on to the next speaker. So next we have Roy Thompson, who's the co-founder and managing director of New Ground Capital. In that role, he has been working on developing impact investing and specifically also working on the build to rent programs within New Zealand. So again, addressing the sort of affordable housing crisis we face. He is also the founder and chair of NZSIP, which builds off-site efficient homes to be transported onto site. So with that introduction, Roy, over to you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Seb, and kia ora, everyone. Nice to be here to share a few thoughts around green construction. Yeah, I've got to say that Sean's going to be a hard act to follow, but I'll give my best shot. We're going to rattle through a quick presentation and then hopefully have a few minutes at the end for any questions there might be. We'll finish up with a quick video if we've got time. So I've been asked to speak on green construction, obviously, the challenges, opportunities, and a few New Zealand examples. It's a fairly broad topic, obviously. I'll spend a couple of minutes just to introduce myself in a little bit more detail so that you understand the perspectives from which I'm coming from. And then we'll talk about green construction and the drivers really behind green construction, and then come on to the challenges, opportunities, and New Zealand examples. My background is really around residential, so please excuse me for focusing primarily on residential rather than commercial or industrial. As Seb mentioned, New Ground is a specialist impact investment manager. We've got two areas of focus. One is institutional build to rent that we've been spearheading since 2014. And in that space, we're proud to include investment partners such as the New Zealand Super Fund, Ngāi Tahu, other iwi, community trusts, and increasingly of interest to not-for-profits. And we also co-founded the country's first committed impact investment fund alongside Akina Foundation, and you've got Nicola talking later in the day, the Impact Enterprise Fund. And please excuse the shameless pitch, but we're currently raising a new impact fund, Homes for Tamariki. On New Zealand structural insulated panels, that is a business rather that I was a co-founder of and chair. So we're an off-site prefabricator of structural insulated panels for commercial and residential builds. It's particularly sought after for passive house style construction due to very low operational carbon footprint. Manufactured mainly out of New Zealand-made timber products. And these panels provide R values, or thermal insulation values, of between 4.5 and 9. And just to put that into perspective, the New Zealand Building Code, which is basically the worst possible building you can legally build, that requires R values of, say, 1.3 for floors or 1.9 for walls, so significantly higher than building code standard. And we've recently, I think that's been reflected in the fact that we've recently been winning some contracts from fairly specialist organisations such as Callaghan Innovation, Niwa Brands, and currently just completing some new structures, scientific huts that are on their way down to Antarctica next month. And in fact, the image in the background there is a residential home that we delivered for a customer in Queenstown, in Speargrass Flat there, pretty cold environment, and that house needs no heating energy at all even during the winter months. So as you can see, I've got I guess a combination of perspectives spanning the development of large-scale residential, but also the manufacture and supply of green construction materials. So what is green construction, I suppose, is the first and most obvious question. What's going on there? So according to Wikipedia, green construction refers to both the structure and an application of processes that are environmentally responsible and resource efficient throughout the building's life cycle. A process requiring close cooperation of the contractor, architects, engineers, and investor or client. It really expands and complements classical building design concerns. It's not in place of course, it's complementary to, and it's really focused around ensuring that people, planet and profit are essential considerations in the building of new homes or any type of construction for that matter. What are the drivers behind green construction? Well, firstly, and I guess most obviously, reducing CO2 emissions. So according to a report last year from the UN, building and construction sector globally accounts for some 38% of all energy-related CO2 emissions, which I think is consistent with what Sean mentioned earlier. And direct CO2 emissions need to halve by 2030 to get on track for net carbon zero by 2050. I haven't been able to find data on our direction of travel, but I'm pretty certain we're nowhere near that target. And looking locally here in New Zealand, according to ThinkStep ANZ, New Zealand's built environment is, they believe, is responsible for approximately 20% of New Zealand's gross carbon footprint. And that might be surprising for you when you look at that little pie chart there, particularly in the fact that nutrition is a smaller amount than what you may have otherwise seen, including agri. But in putting together these figures, ThinkStep have looked at carbon based on where the actual carbon is consumed as opposed to where it's produced. The next driver is reducing waste. I'm sure we've all seen situations like is depicted in the image there. It's particularly in the demolition stage. Most obviously, waste is a massive issue in buildings generally. Radio New Zealand have done a couple of reports on this recently and identified that in Auckland alone, construction and demolition produce nearly 570,000 tonnes of waste a year, which is roughly half the total volume of waste going to Auckland's landfills, equivalent to some 23,000 shipping containers, which is a pretty horrendous figure. And every new house build produces about 4.5 tonnes of waste, equivalent to 30 years for a household. So those are huge problems in themselves. Improving health and well-being. This is, I guess, something that's sitting in the background right across New Zealand. It doesn't get near enough attention, although the government has been making some good efforts recently to help force improvements, not only in the construction of new buildings, but also in the upgrading and the better insulation of existing buildings. If we go back to Census 2018, we can see that some 280,000 children, about 28%, were living in damp housing, and about 24% of children living in housing with mould present. Now, even if you put aside the direct impact on the lives of those children and their families, if we look at it from a sort of an NZ Inc. perspective, and according to a UNICEF report, that translates into 40,000 children in New Zealand being admitted to hospital each year with health-related issues stemming from poor quality housing. And according to their own research, that translates to something like $1,500 per child per day cost to taxpayers as a result of those housing-related issues. Next comes regulation, and Grant Robertson referred to some of this earlier on when he talked about disclosure. But there's two big changes coming that are going to force increased focus on green construction. The first is MB's proposed framework designed to help make homes warmer, drier, and better ventilated, which they call the Building for Climate Change program. And secondly, a global initiative, the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is being implemented and rolled out by the Financial Stability Board. And that's something that all, particularly property-related lenders, are starting to focus on, and will focus on much more so going forward. Just a quick note in terms of who's providing leadership in the space in New Zealand, in case that's of interest. It's really two champions that I'd like to point to here. One is the New Zealand Green Building Council, whose mission is really to promote the sustainable green homes and buildings for happier, healthier New Zealanders, and the Super Home Movement, which is more of a, I guess, a grassroots organisation, but really supporting what the green building council is doing. So let's look for a minute at the challenges in the green building or green construction space, and certainly there are a great many. The first that I'd want to focus on really relates to designs and material specification related issues. So when you're designing from a green perspective, relative to traditional building methods, I suppose, or design methods, you're really taking a much longer term whole of life approach versus what typically happens, say, in build to sell housing, where builders or developers are just wanting to sell as quickly as they can, maximize their profit, not so concerned about the cost to operate the building or the downstream impacts that might flow from the design or the materials used in the building. When you take a longer term sort of whole of life approach, these are the kind of issues that you really need to grapple with. What sort of density is appropriate, and Sean alluded to that earlier on. The example of Barcelona versus Atlanta, how livable it is. You can take density too far and then sacrifice livability, of course. Durability and manageability are absolutely key. Sustainability, which really spans all aspects of a building and the ongoing operation of the building. Cost efficiency, how the building is going to value up. What sort of approach valuers are going to take? Are they going to be comfortable with the sort of green design or materials that you might be incorporating within the building? You might have the greenest type of material that you want to incorporate in your building, but if it isn't brands appraised, if councils aren't going to be comfortable with it, just because it's too new, too innovative, you'll find actually that valuers value it very poorly, and that may in itself make a project unfeasible. So I guess what we grapple with day to day is a continual process of sort of cost benefit trade-offs. And I think thinking about some of the points that Sean was making, one of the things that isn't really being considered enough, but certainly will be considered much more going forward, is sort of building resilience into the way that we're approaching our design and material selection decisions. And he used the Burj Khalifa example. Those types of issues aren't being considered today, but they certainly will be. So using new ground as an example, I mean, we're continually trying to improve the sustainability aspects of our build to rent assets. We're now building some of our properties to Homestar 8 standards. And in doing so, we constantly try and focus on timber construction over higher embodied carbon steel and concrete type designs. However, it does come at a cost. And when we look at some of our competitors out there in the market, we estimate that in some instances, probably the most extreme instances, our build costs are as much as 50% higher, our base build costs, than if we'd used, say, a fairly basic traditional concrete construction design. And timber, as you may have read in the media, timber is, strangely, in New Zealand, is scarce and it's relatively expensive, which is kind of a bizarre situation considering how much timber we grow. And we're now grappling as a country, I think it's just this kind of ridiculous situation where, we're exporting vast quantities of unprocessed logs out of New Zealand, primarily to China, with no value add. And now we're turning around, and on those very same ships that are taking logs to China, the government actually are now using those same ships to bring back steel prefabricated modular houses, the steel for which was probably dug out of the ground in Western Australia and shipped to China in the first instance, which altogether is a pretty poor picture. And I would sort of challenge this situation and say that cannot make sense from an NZ point of view, that we're growing all this fantastic timber, but actually we're just exporting it in raw form and then increasingly trying to bring back steel houses, importing labour, and a fairly carbon horrendous product at the same time. In terms of opportunities, well, I mean, obviously there's an opportunity to use more timber in our construction, particularly for taller buildings. It's not easy, but it can be done, and it is being done overseas increasingly. This is a building that we've just finished earlier this year in Queenstown. It's a 7-story, primarily timber based building, which, you know, we relied on prefabrication offsite, importing most of the components as modules into Queenstown and really assembling the building there. Not a cheap process to do in a place like Queenstown. Nothing's cheap to build in Queenstown, let alone when you're trying to do something innovative like this. But I think it does show that these types of buildings can be done. So this particular structure was built around some precast concrete cores that then, you know, the timber structure essentially hangs off those. So ticks a lot of boxes from a low embodied carbon sustainability point of view, not necessarily cheap to do and tough to make it stack up from a financial perspective. And then the other opportunity is, and it should be obvious, to make more healthy, livable, affordable and feasible homes, which really is all about healthier environments for occupants. High performance building, which means that it's going to be efficient to operate, reducing operating costs overall, and actually increasingly opening up favourable finance options, which Sean talked about, and making sure that the building is optimised for resale value down the track, which I have to believe is going to be more and more the case. So quickly, a few New Zealand examples. Firstly, I thought it might be interesting to focus on Hobsonville Point. That's as a suburb, really. Hobsonville Point used to be an airbase in government control. Government appointed or formed an agency, Hobsonville Land Company, to turn the former airbase into a relatively intensive residential suburb, which you can see in the background there. The buildings in the foreground are buildings that Newground developed together with New Zealand Superfund and Ngāi Tahu. So we had an experience as an early builder partner in Hobsonville Point. And we found it an excellent process, actually, working with HLC, the land developer, who mandated that ourselves and their other builder partners had to follow a series of energy and water efficiency features that we were required to incorporate into our designs. So those 7 primary features included heat pumps or solar hot water heating, insulation levels above building code, houses oriented towards the sun, LED lighting, recycling of rainwater off roofs into toilets, laundries and garden water, water efficient showers, taps and toilets, and fold away washing lines that can minimize dry use. And a lot of those things probably sound pretty straightforward, common sense, but actually certainly at the time that HLC was really spearheading Hobsonville Point, a lot of those things were very new and innovative. Certainly builder partners weren't used to having those sorts of requirements foisted upon them. There's a lot of pushback, but I think they've now been broadly adopted, and you'll find a lot of those early builder partners at Hobsonville Point are now absolutely following all of these same principles in their developments elsewhere around New Zealand, even though they don't necessarily need to. And in terms of what it delivered, overall, HLC, which has now been folded into Kāinga Ora as the land development arm of Kāinga Ora, those design features, they believe, have reduced residents' electricity consumption by 25% and water consumption by 32%. So pretty convincing data there. This is the tall timber building that I alluded to or mentioned earlier in Queenstown. We don't need to spend too much time on that. This is another one of our own projects that we've got under construction in Glen Innes and Tamaki at the moment, where we're incorporating a passive house duplex made out of actually our PUR SIPs, which will be Homestar 8. And we've also built into this particular project a solar electric centralized hot water heating system. So that's relatively unusual system in New Zealand, much more common in Australia, Europe, and North America, but only gaining some traction here. And essentially, the hot water acts as a battery, if you like, for the solar system, backed up with electric heating as well. The water is continually circulating around a ring main, so that residents get basically instant hot water and don't waste any energy running all the cold water through the tap before the hot water kicks in. Radically more energy efficient than normal electric hot water cylinders, for instance. Looking now to some of the government initiatives, Kāinga Ora down in Mangere have a passive house pilot going on called Beta Ventura, which are 18 three-story homes that they're building to passive house standard, which they say, and we would agree, is a win for both occupant and the wider environment, hopefully also for the taxpayer. From a sustainability perspective, those homes should reduce operational energy carbon by more than 70%, and heating by around 85%. And they're targeting, like us in Tamaki, they're targeting an 8 home star rating. For the residents themselves, they should expect very low heating bills, maybe around about $1 a day on their electricity bill to heat the home, and a very comfortable ambient temperature inside the home of pretty stable between 20 and 25 degrees. I'm just going to finish up quickly with a little video here on the other Kāinga Ora project which I wanted to mention, which is in Glendowie. This is a really innovative showcase, I think, that Kāinga Ora is spearheading, and it got a lot of attention at the recent COP26 event in Glasgow. So I'll let the video speak for itself, and then hopefully there'll be a few minutes for any questions afterwards.
Sorry, Roy, we're running a bit low on time, but I would suggest, could we share the video during the break with the online audience while we go off and have a cup of coffee or something? Would that be all right?
For sure.
Cool, thank you. I think that would be a nice thing to do during the break, actually. We do have a question for you, and the first question comes from Henry. Do you also include provision for green community spaces within your high density projects?
Yes, we do. It is, of course, challenging when you're doing high density housing. But yeah, we always particularly make sure there's some community or sort of communal space, if you like, where people can get together and socialize. Look for things like rooftop green space, for instance, vegetable garden areas, that sort of thing. But that comes back to the cost benefit trade-off, and those are real issues that we grapple with day to day.
Great, thank you. And I actually had one question. Sean talked about, the green premium or the decreased cost of lending if you issue a green bond. You kind of alluded to something similar. I was wondering, do you think that type of discount on lending would eventually make its way, or maybe already has made its way, into personal mortgages for building? So for individual builds, say if I wanted to build a house?
I think there are some examples of that already happening in New Zealand, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think ANZ might have a program up and running today. We're certainly yet to see anything on the development funding side, and I think that's probably still quite some time away. But I think on the residential housing side, there are some examples already existing in the market.
Great, thank you very much for your time, Roy. And I'll have a chat with you at the start of the break, and we'll get that video on for everyone.